So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk us through how economists are viewing the economy. I'm going to keep my video off to save some bandwidth. So we're going to start with the national level. We're going to go to the local level. We're going to talk a little bit about Sierra County. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we will walk through those at the end of the session today. Economists have four major themes on their mind. One is the new administration and the amount of spending that is going to be attempted to push through Congress to help not only get through the current situation, but also through the next 3 or 4 years with respect to making investment. And the game right now is whether or not we're going to see continued transfer payments or we're going to see investment in the economy. So that's a major governmental theme going forward with the new administration. We know we've had another round of fiscal stimulus. We will see how that helps bridge some of the gaps between now and true economic recovery. Yesterday, the governor in California lifted the stay-at-home order that was generalized in December. We'll see if that helps boost businesses and hiring going into February and March. But there is always going to be some lag effect as a result of having those kind of policies change. The next thing is that we have to see those vaccines work. We need to see the caseloads go down, and we ultimately need to have some semblance of feeling like we're truly turning the corner on this thing. If we don't have that, businesses are still going to be reticent to make investments, still going to be reticent to hire, and that's going to mean that we're going to continue to have a slow-moving economy. I'll show you some data later about how the labor market has evolved over the last couple of months, given the return of social constraints on businesses and also just the lack of movement in both Washington and with the vaccines moving around the economy. But what we do know so far is that our low-wage workers are being hurt by the current situation the most. And I'll show you some data on that later for California. But it is something to think about in two major items. Is one, that in specific industries, we may not see the capacity of the economy come back for those low-wage workers to be rehired in terms of the types of jobs they did 1 year ago, and those jobs still being around in the local area. And second, we're concerned about how that might affect social services demand and already pinched budgets at the city, county, and state level with respect to delivering social services as demand rises and the amount of money around to spend on social services has gone down, and or we're waiting for it from the federal government that hasn't quite come yet. So the two rounds of fiscal stimulus have helped to a certain extent, but they really have acted as bridges to hopefully a better tomorrow. And what we're looking at is the next couple of quarters to see if that better tomorrow comes. We've been focused very much on the labor market as economists over the last year, and that's because we saw so many people get out of work or lose their job, I should say. But there's a bunch of different ways that people become unemployed. And so what I want to show you is the last 13 years of data to really contrast how the Great Recession, the last recession that was a major recession, historically speaking, had its effects on the labor market versus this one. This recession initially was a temporary job loss recession. If you look to the far right-hand side, these data reflect temporary job loss. And that big spike on the far right-hand side represents March 2020 forward. Big spike up, people getting their jobs back, people also not getting their jobs back, as I'll show you in a second. And that slow conversion of the economy to something looks more like actual recession rather than a natural disaster recession. So that was the big spike, and it's historic because here's the Great Recession now in contrast. You can see that blue hill because a lot of people lost their jobs permanently. Now, the difference between these two, temporary job loss is a situation in which your employer says, we're not going to have a job available for you for now, but we do want to rehire you as soon as we open back up again. That's why you saw that big spike. But a lot of businesses had to close their doors based on social policy, assume they would get back to business and it wouldn't be that long. And once the timeline started to expand, we saw people convert from temporary job loss either back to their jobs or to permanent job loss. And that's why that blue area on the far right-hand side is getting bigger. But you'll notice in about a quarter of the way moving left to right, the Great Recession had this gigantic surge in people permanently losing their jobs, which is the typical way in which recession affects the labor market. Well, other ways in which people could become unemployed are they complete a temporary job, they leave their job or they quit. They re-enter the labor force because they were out of it previously. And this is something we're watching just as a quick sidebar of the number of people who chose to walk away from either looking for a job or taking a job because they had to deal with childcare at home while schools were closed and childcare was closed. Now we're seeing a slow re-entrance of people back into the labor force, probably because some of those changes are now coming, and we've started to adjust. And so have children, or that now you're seeing partners adjust to a life at home where the other partner can now go back to work. The other is re-entering or new entry in the labor force, which is usually high school students and college students who have graduated. So that's the situation. If you look at the far right-hand side, the more rainbow color this graph becomes, the more troublesome it is for our economy to recover. And so it's kind of a weird trade-off we're at right now. We've got to get more people employed, and we need all those numbers to start fading down. If you look at the US level and the types of jobs that were lost, this is April 2020 compared to April 2019. So this is the percentage of people that lost a job that 1 year stretch. And April was the big bad month for the American economy nationally. Here's November. So this shows you where recovery has happened. And in some cases, recovery was stronger than others. You can see construction, very good recovery. Government jobs, not so much, but not a whole lot of loss in the first place. And then moving left to right, you'll see a lot of those industries basically have recovered more or less, with a couple of exceptions. But the far right-hand side is where a lot of the trouble still exists. Hotels, bars, restaurants, places where we gather, event centers, all that's kind of boiled into those two right-hand side industries. A lot of lower wage workers in those areas, easy entry into those jobs, relatively low skill base to get into those jobs, but very tough right now in terms of not getting hired back because of social restrictions, and also simply because the outlook is not great for 2021 just yet in terms of people traveling. This is December. So December brought us back to some social restrictions across the United States, and thus we gave back a little bit. So the way you read these percentages are, for example, on the far right-hand side for accommodation, 32 people out of 100 who had a job December 2019 were out of work December 2020. So that's a lot of people in that one category, very historically high numbers in terms of job loss. To get a perspective on how the current recession and ultimate recovery is starting to show its face, we're going to look at this contrasted to the Great Recession for the US. So if we start the Great Recession in November 2007, where we felt like as economists that we started to see the wobbliness in the American economy before the big downturn in 2008 and 9, we're also going to time this to January 2020 to show you the evolution of both recessions and ultimately both recovery periods on a monthly basis. Here's the Great Recession. So you can see that starting in basically month 0, we start at 100. That red dotted line is where we need to get back to. And there's this long time period in which the American economy lost jobs and then slowly recovered them back. It took about 76 months. So over that long timeline, we were in the shadow of the recession, just getting back to the number of people working that we started the recession 76 months previous. So about 6 years and 4 months later, we finally got back to where we started. Well, this is the current situation where we heard a lot about a V-shaped recovery. Well, there is that V shape. So there's your letter in the alphabet soup of recession and recovery that you've been hearing on the news. But that right-hand leg of the V curling is problematic. So we're hoping that this is a short-term curl and we will start to move up toward the red line. But it also suggests the dynamics of this recession and ultimate recovery are much different than the Great Recession. And you think about comparisons, it's best to compare to the Great Recession because it's the one that's closest to us in time. We in both cases, we really needed these lines to move back up to the red dotted line to feel like that we actually had full recovery. The more that black line curls away from it, the longer it's going to take to recover. And that's the key. It's not so much whether or not we're in recession or not, it's how far away are we from recovering once recovery happens. And economies want to grow. It's a matter of how they're able to grow. And that curl suggests that we've had some constraints or some frictions in making that growth a reality. Here's financial markets. So one bright light, and I'll show you another one later in terms of housing, has been our equity markets have not faded yet. This is just through the end of the year, but here are the last 3 recessions in contrast. And you can see the dot-com recession on the far left-hand side was sort of this slow dribble down over time. It took about 2 years to bottom out. And then we had pretty good growth, comparatively speaking, and got back to historic highs at the time before the market dropped again, where it plummeted in the Great Recession down to that number 735, but then has been on this wild bull market basically for about 11 years straight, and almost 12 now by the time May 2021 comes around, assuming that we continue to see growth. But you can see all these hiccups along the way from that second shaded area to the third shaded area, where that quick cut down to 2652 was what happened in March and early April. but then we've been on a nice streak ever since. Well, a lot of that is predicated upon the idea that rates of interest are going to remain low, and that most of the growth in our equity markets are coming from businesses like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, the big hitters in terms of technology or having technology as a basis of their business. Our lives have become more technologically based. Hence, we've seen more growth in those stocks because people are buying into those, believing that they're going to see more and more revenue. As long as that continues, and we feel relatively confident that those businesses are continuing to, in a sense, pull other businesses behind them, our equity market should be okay. But the more and more growth that happens, this is always kind of this is basically a maxim of equity markets. At some point, you're going to see some profit taking. Just assume that's going to come. It really depends if it's rational profit taking or a mass psychosis, if you will, to get out of the market as soon as possible because you believe that the end is now come. Policymakers are trying to avoid that kind of behavior with investors. And so far, it's worked, even though we saw a lot of wacky stuff happen in March and April 2020. Another thing we're watching, which does affect equity market outcomes, is the amount of debt that Americans have piled up at their households. And so what I'm going to show you here is the evolution of debt since 2003, because it, again, will show you the Great Recession, and it'll show you the latest data we have through the third quarter of 2020. We expected initially that people were really going to pile on to debt, just trying to make ends meet. But the fiscal stimulus delayed that kind of decision making, which was a good thing. In the sense that it provided income at home, either through augmented unemployment benefits or direct transfer payment from the government in terms of the checks that have come to houses. That has helped sort of, keep the debt market relatively stable and rational. Well, the biggest way in which we hold debt is in our homes. So here's mortgage debt over the last 17 years, and you can see the sort of the hill we've gone up, or we went up to get to the top of the housing situation, and then the crisis hit, and we started to divest ourselves of housing and other debt-driven instruments that took us to a bottoming out. It took a while for the housing market to sort itself out, and then we've been climbing slowly ever since. And that slow climb is inflation adjusted. So notice how quick the hill was run up before the recession, and it's been a slow comeback. Well, that's a good thing. We actually have more nominal debt, meaning that more not inflation adjusted debt than ever before. But if you think about the value of that debt versus 14 years ago, that's something that, it should be less of a burden on households if we've had real economic growth, and we have. So this is a good sign that we don't have a lot of destabilization building in our debt markets that could easily undermine our ability to recover. Here's home equity lines of credit, auto loans, credit cards, and I'll stop here because we expected credit cards to surge up. That has not happened just yet, at least. Student lending, which hasn't changed a lot. It's built up a little bit, but not much. And then a bunch of other debt instruments. So you can see that we're still in inflation adjusted terms below the peak, which is good. So we don't expect a lot of problems coming out of our debt markets like we saw in the Great Recession for now. We do need to have economic recovery, or some of these good things are going to slowly be eroded by the fact that we haven't had jobs recovery. And that's why I started with jobs, and I'm going to ultimately end talking about jobs. The IMF just this morning released their broader economic outlook. So to wrap up on the national side, I also want to give you a sprinkle of international news. Here's where the IMF sees the US going this year and next. 5.1% growth of inflation adjusted income. Think of it as basically the amount of wages and profits being made by businesses, the growth from one year to the next, which is good. And then 2.5% 2022, slower but positive, negative 3.4 for the US last year. So those numbers are basically where economists have thought we were going to go the next couple of years, and that last year was going to be a little bit nasty in some, even though the third and fourth quarters are going to be relatively positive. This suggests that recovery is being predicted. We do need to turn some corners, and it's a critical context to think about the local economy. Okay, so with all that built up, now let's talk about California and Sierra County as best we can. The data on Sierra County are somewhat sparse because it's a relatively small rural county in California, but there are some contrasts and comparisons we can do. Here are labor market data for California, Sacramento, and Sierra County. You can see here that California is at 8.8% as of December 2020 unemployment rate, with about 2.8% reduced of the total labor force. Now, why that's critical is that we just don't know where those people are. We don't know if they've left the state. We don't know if they retired from 1 year ago. So these data all compare 1 year ago or December 2019. For Sierra County, not a lot of people changes. Percentage changes are a little bit large, but that's because Sierra County is a relatively small place. But the unemployment rate's at 7% in Sierra County, which is relatively good. Again, for a small rural county, it's a little bit tricky because, as you'll see in a minute, the data are relatively volatile. And we know that Sierra County kind of has these natural seasonal cycles in it in terms of its labor market. But Sacramento is doing a little bit better in terms of some of these metrics, but still at 7.9% unemployment. In Sacramento, San Diego, and San Francisco have been driving a lot of the recovery throughout California. The Los Angeles area has had a really tough go. But in general, places like Sierra County did not have as much suffering on the front end and thus are recovering slightly more quickly. Now, let's look at a similar picture we saw before for California as we saw for the US. We're going to start the recession in California in November 2007, even though it started slightly earlier than that in California because of its exposure to the housing market. And then we're going to show the COVID-19 recession and ultimately where we're at in recovery. Here's the California labor market, and you can see it took about 56 months to get back to the original amount of employment that we saw. So California entered a little earlier and exited a little, exited the recession and ultimately got recovered a little earlier than the US, but not by much. And in the middle, the US did a little bit faster growth, and it took a little longer for California to bottom out. But once we started to get some steam, we got moving. Here is the COVID-19 situation. It actually looks very similar to the US without as much of a curl effect, but it's getting there. So after 12 months of time, we are still waiting to see if we're going to get back up to that red line. And for California, the last 2 months have been some give back in terms of jobs, which has not been good. We, just like the last picture, we need that black line to move up to the red, just like we needed in the Great Recession. Now, same thing we saw before, but now for California, this is industrial job loss. And you'll see here, this is April 2020, some real hard hits, leisure and hospitality and other services, where other services are hair salons, nail salons, and those kind of businesses where the client and the business are relatively close to each other. You can see there's a big percentage changes. Well, now I'm going to walk you through all the months here to December to see the recovery in California. Here's May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and then you can see here, I'm going to stop because you can see recovery across almost every one of these industries, a couple little hiccups in California here and there, but then there's December where we gave some back across the board. We gave a little bit back in November across the board in some, but not by much. This time we gave a lot back. So one of the things we're concerned about is that when the social policies became more restrictive, it affected the entire state economy in a general way, but those last two, or the leisure and hospitality and other services, were affected more. Department of Finance in California just put out their forecast going to 2024. So I showed you the IMF forecast for the US and a bunch of different countries, most of which had negative growth in 2020, positive outlook for 21 and 22. As part of the governor's budget process for 2021, 2022, the coming fiscal year, the Department of Finance does a forecast looking 3 years out. It allows a projection of potential budget surpluses or deficits and just thinking about the dynamics of how incomes are going to come to the state of California. This is based on jobs. So here's the Great Recession. These data are from 2005 on a quarterly basis forward, and you can see the Great Recession is very obvious. It's in that shaded area, but you can see the amount of people working slid down, just like we saw, but in a kind of a little bit different way, and then picked back up by about mid-2013, basically back up to where we started, and then on a nice smooth ride up to the peak where you see that 110.5. These are index numbers because it's really more about the percentage change in jobs, and then we see that big V cut happen down, pop back up, not quite to where we started, and then this curl effect going forward. So the Department of Finance is expecting that we're going to continue to recover basically in a smooth way, but it's going to take probably till the end of 2024 to get back to more or less where we started in 2020 with the number of people working in California. Now, there's a couple of dynamics in there. There's going to be some people moving around in California. There's going to be some people leaving California. There's going to be some people coming to California. There's going to be businesses doing that same migration pattern. When you add all that up, it might take California a little bit longer than the US to recover on this one because of its exposure to the travel industry, the entertainment industry, and really the unfortunately, the Los Angeles area in general might see a really, really slow comeback versus how it's come back in the past. But a lot of those questions are still up in the air. This forecast is just one way of viewing the smooth transition from the current situation toward more or less full recovery of the jobs, and then hopefully growth after that. You can see here the current situation, which should have been obvious already. But the other little nuance here is we're not expecting that we'll have recession declared any longer than Q4 2020. We should hear some declaration in the first quarter of 2021 that the recession is quote unquote over technically, but for a lot of people at low wages, it may linger for some time, which I'll show you in a minute. Okay, now let's look at some data for Sierra County to give some contrast. Same graph. This is a picture after I actually deseasonalized the data because it was so wacky to try to show this graph for Sierra County based on the way the labor market works there, which is typical and classic of rural California, by the way. You can see the seasonal aspects of both the agricultural side and also the tourism side. Down you go. In terms of the jobs, and one of the nuances of this is not only the seasonality in Sierra County, but also that the jobs that were lost after the Great Recession happened were never recovered to date, unfortunately. So you can actually see the COVID-19 recession on the far right-hand side, which is now repeated here. So just like the other graphs for Sierra County, we do need to get that black line to move back up to the red. And if we don't, then jobs that were there 1 year ago are not going to come back very quickly. And at some point, in fact, the reason I show this is because this graph has a little bit longer shelf life than the next graph I'm going to show you, because we're going to be comparing this to 2019 for some time as sort of a baseline. But either way, the more you want to monitor what's going on in Sierra County, monitor that black line moving up. And all these data are public, by the way. They all come from California EDD or the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Either way, both organizations monitor Sierra County and all the counties in California otherwise. Okay. The data on job losses, unfortunately, are in tighter buckets with respect to how it's reported. Here are job losses in April 2020, May 2020, and then right on through June, July, August, September, October, November, and I'll stop there. The goods producing and services producing. Goods producing is basically the sum of construction and manufacturing and a sprinkle of sort of agriculturally based jobs that are connected to natural resources. Services is everything else besides government, and the government's on the right-hand side. And you can see that overall, which is the total non-farm, outside of farming, we've seen a nice climb back up. Farming has had some suffering, but in the December data and November, we basically went back to where we started. A lot of that's because of the seasonal aspects of what happens in Sierra County, that of course that November and December don't really have much change because there's not a lot of farming going on there, so there's not a lot of extra hiring. You can the non-farm is generally the more important to the overall evolution of the economy, still down, but climbing way back up from the initial downturn, picking a little bit or losing a little bit of that recovery steam, unfortunately, in December. So this is it sort of at a high industrial level for Sierra County, very similar to other parts of rural California. There's nothing different, but it does show you kind of where a lot of the suffering remains. Okay. Well, one place in which we haven't seen a lot of suffering has been in housing. Even though some parts of California have seen a little bit of trickiness in housing, here is what's been going on with some comparisons, and then I'll show you Sierra County, which is on the right-hand side. These data are the percentage change in the median home price as estimated by Zillow, which has this beautiful, huge, publicly available database on using their data on what's going on in housing being pulled from all kinds of sources. The percentage changes you'll see is positive across the board here of these comparison areas. Here's California, Sacramento County, and a bunch of different counties, more or less in northeastern California. And you can see Sierra County on the far right-hand side, 3.6% growth over the last year with respect to median home price, and then a little bit larger over 2 years. Now, the good thing about that is that versus the last recession where we had job loss and housing price loss, we've had job loss this time, but housing markets have remained relatively stable. There's a dubious aspect to that. It's because we haven't built a lot of houses, so the supply side of the housing market hasn't changed that much, and the conditions to demand have been relatively strong. It'll take us a couple years to actually sort out, except on the ground. In Sierra County, you probably know folks that have moved there from other places and demanded some of those houses that didn't start in Sierra County or really in more rural northeastern California. They that transition from the urban to or suburban to the rural is something we're watching closely to see if more and more people bring their portable job to places where they believe they have a better quality of life versus the urban or suburban area, and how stable their job will be based on that move. But for right now, those data show that the last year or so have been good, and that we haven't seen the same housing market problems that we saw in the Great Recession. And you can see Sierra County there highlighted. Now, this is the forecast looking forward 1 year toward the end of this year, which is these data just came out, but they are looking from December to December. So this is basically a 2021 forecast of housing across California and a bunch of the major areas in California. You can see Truckee in the middle, and places like basically in the foothill area or mountainous area of California in the northeast portion. Across the board, very solid forecasts. So again, why is this happening? Low interest rates, people are renting at high prices. The current housing market gives them a lot of incentives to move from rental to buy. And as long as those units are coming up, you're going to see multiple bids and sort of a relatively frothy housing market for the time being. But again, so much of that depends on continued recovery. And the cost of this, because there's always an opportunity cost in economics, the cost of this is it's making housing less affordable. And these are things we were talking about previous to COVID-19 that seemed like they're a topic that was up the same time the dinosaurs were walking the earth at this point. Well, why this is going to become an issue is that the Biden White House is very concerned about equity. This split is something that the Biden administration talked a lot about during the campaign, that high wage workers have had very little change in their lives. These data here are only through October 2020, but show a split in the jobs recovery with respect to high wage workers, the blue line, lower wage workers, that sort of greenish line. And you can see the two are fading from each other. This is a so-called K-shaped recovery, if you want to go into, again, that alphabet soup. This is heavily talked about because it becomes now ultimately equity policy at the White House and then moving through the states, where California is one of the grand examples of this split. It's not anomalous to California, meaning that other states have this split as well, but in California, the split's a little wider. See, about 28% of the folks that make less than $27,000 a year in California were out of a job that had one in January 2020. That's how you read these data. It's the percentage change in jobs in these categories from January 2020 as the benchmark date. Well, there's low wages, or high wages, I'm sorry. There's low wages, there's the split. And the broader problems, as we talked about off the top, local governments pinched more on services and having to come up with money to help folks that are now demanding that. Our nonprofits, our food banks, our other sort of social services arms and social assistance arms are asked for more services. The ability for people to stay in their homes and their apartments, or maybe even leave the area completely. We're watching closely how this affects multifamily pricing and ultimately transactions. And how easy is it for local businesses to hire back if the local workforce cannot continue to remain in the local area? That's a key thing going forward. Small business has struggled to stay open. The trick is whether or not they're permanently or temporarily closed. These data, all these data, the last two slides I'm showing you here are about are coming from Harvard University in what's called tracktherecovery.org. It's a partnership with the Gates Foundation. And they're using all kinds of data sources to try to track what's going on in the recovery, where this is meant to really look at small businesses. So think of businesses under 25 people for California, and specifically places like Sierra County. About half the businesses that were open in January 2020 are closed as of the end of the year. Now, that closure, again, it's critical to recognize that this does not mean that they are closed permanently. We just don't know yet. They just simply do